Good evening, friends. On behalf of NIAC National and NIAC Colorado, we welcome you to our Know Your Rights event. This evening will be a wonderful overview of your civil rights, employment discrimination laws, immigration, and banking laws and policies. We have a wonderful panel here tonight to overview the agenda for the evening. We're going to start with two testimonials from local NIAC Colorado members, followed by an attorney panel of three attorneys who will do a presentation. Following that, we'll do a Q&A of questions that the NIAC team has gathered to ask our expert panel, and then we will open things up to a Q&A of your questions for our expert panel. And lastly, we'll have some closing remarks. We're going to go ahead and get started with our two testimonials. From first, Caitlin Machette, who's joining us on the phone, who's a NIAC Colorado member, originally from Arkansas, who works in IT. Turn it over to you, Caitlin.
Hello, everyone. I thought it was really important to share my story because it kind of just shows that it's very important to stand up if you're being, discriminated against. And what happened in my situation, I went to medical school in Arkansas, which is known for racism and things like that. And when I went to school, I would often wear like shirts from Iran that my cousins would bring me because I was proud of them, And unfortunately, that got me targeted by a teacher who wanted to practice racism towards me because she basically said, that I forged some paperwork and started making up all this stuff. And she tried to kick me out of school. But, I had fought and I showed that I was innocent and they let me back in the program. Not long after that, she tried it again to get me kicked out of the school. And, she would watch my every move and she would always write down everything like everyone else. And she finally got this hospital involved that I was doing clinicals with. She got the hospital person to say that they didn't want me there anymore and they couldn't give me a reason. It was like, no, we don't want you here anymore, so you can't continue the program. And my dad, he's experienced racism coming over here at 26 years old with no English, so he knew what I was going through. And he fought hard with me and got a lawyer and everything, but they still kicked me out of school that second time. And then after that, I went to the dean. I went to, the presidents of the banks in Arkansas. I mean, we spread the word everywhere about this teacher. And finally, years later, she got fired for racism. So it just shows like maybe not in your journey that you can, solve the issue, but the work that you put in really does matter.
Thank you, Caitlin, for sharing your story with us. I'm sure that a lot of people who are listening here can connect with that type of an experience. And that's why we're doing this event here this evening, to get some answers on what our rights are when situations like this arise. So thank you for sharing that. Next, we have our testimonial by Katie Razavi, who's an NIAC Colorado Leadership Council member. She's also an epidemiologist who works for a global health nonprofit. Katie, will you please share your story with us?
Thanks so much for having me, Shadi. It would be my pleasure. So the company I work for had its bank account frozen this winter since our global scientific and public health work includes Iran. Our local US representative had gone onto our website and saw that our work includes Iran. Our company had already made it clear that our work with Iran did not include financial transactions. However, our local representative went on vacation and our company account was flagged and frozen when he was unresponsive. The managing director of our company is also Iranian-American, and he had to call the vice president of US Bank to get the account unfrozen. US Bank did, however, cover the cost of the bounce checks.
Katie, thank you for sharing that with us. I'm sure our expert panel will be able to address the issues that arise from that and the legal ramifications and what the rights are of people or an organization in that situation. So thank you for sharing that with us. Next, we have our attorney panel presentation. We have 3 wonderful attorneys with us this evening, and we are really humbled by their presence to share their expertise with us. First, we have Omid Azmudeh. Omid is an attorney at Rathod Mohammad Bahai, LLC. He vigorously advocates on behalf of people, regardless of race, religion, gender, or other status, who experience abuses of power at the hands of the government, corporations, schools, and other institutions. Specifically, Omid's practice focuses on enforcing civil rights and the rights of individuals in the workplace. As written, U.S. laws are supposed to protect every person from all forms of excessive force, discrimination, retaliation, harassment, and assault. Omid's job is to ensure that these laws really work. We also have with us this evening Qusair Mohammad Bahai, who is a partner at Rathod Mohammad Bahai LLC. His practice is exclusively in the areas of plaintiffs' employment discrimination and constitutional civil rights litigation. He advocates for the rights of employees in the workplace and for the civil rights of all individuals against governmental and institutional abuses of power. We are also fortunate enough this evening to have with us Christine Hernandez. She is a seasoned immigration litigation and appellate attorney with over 10 years of experience. Her practice is based in Denver, Colorado, where she's a partner at Hernandez and Associates. Christine's work in immigration law includes the representation of individuals and families before administrative, judicial, and appellate immigration proceedings. Welcome, all 3 of you. We are so fortunate to have you, and I'll turn things over to this panel.
Thank you, Shadi, for the wonderful introductions. We appreciate that. We're going to start the night, folks, with just a general presentation of some slides, which I think give you an overview of some of these areas of law. But, there's a reason why all of these areas require us to do a lot of work, because each individual of them is quite complicated and requires years and years to master, and no one ever really masters them. So tonight we can only give you an overview. So that's our plan. And my experienced team here and my boss, Qusair, will be walking you through some of these issues, at least at a high level, so you can get a sense for what's available out there and what your rights are in your everyday dealings. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Q, who's going to start talking about the most common civil rights issues.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Qusair, and thank you for having us, and thank you, Shadi, for the wonderful introduction. Omid is also being a little shy. He is Iranian, and he does speak Farsi, so he is with his people, and I think he's very. I haven't seen him so excited to do anything, so this is great. So thank you all for this, and this is really important. So we'll try to make this as as applicable as possible. And there is just some kind of law school stuff going on here, but how civil rights in America generally works is there is this statute that you see up there called 42 USC 1983. And what this statute is, it's a federal statute. USC stands for United States Code. And it's a very old statute, but what it does is it allows individuals and sometimes corporations to enforce their constitutional rights. And so what this statute does is it really breathes life into the US Constitution. So for example, everyone is generally aware of the First Amendment, right? the right to free speech, the right to freedom of assembly, that sort of stuff. Well, when your First Amendment rights are violated, for example, you are arrested as a protester during a Black Lives Matter protest, you would sue various government officials under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights through USC 1983. So that is the basic overview. We're very fortunate to have this statute, and sometimes it's important to take a step back. I'm assuming most of the audience has substantial relationships to countries outside of the United States, and this type of law, this type of ability to enforce individual constitutional rights in various courts in the land is something that we should never take for granted. The government, we've seen it unfortunately, and this is not any type of political type of presentation, but we've seen over the years various administrations erode our rights, and they can be taken away. If 42 USC 1983 was somehow rescinded by the government or by the stroke of a president, we would be in a lot of problems. We would be reliant upon state law to protect us. And so these rights that we have, that we enjoy, please remember that they are not permanent, and that if we do not enforce our constitutional rights, we can't expect other people to do it for us. I'm going to skip over Bivens, and then most states have some variety of state mechanisms to enforce what are state constitutional rights. Generally in the law, we consider the federal constitution to create the floor, sort of the base minimum of what our rights are. And then we allow states to sort of create what we call the ceiling, which is the upper end of our rights. So please be aware that there are very, very much rights and constitutional protections under state and federal laws. I think we can go on to the next slide, unless Omid, you had anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that's perfect.
Okay. So Fourth Amendment, this is one of the most, this is probably one of the most litigated constitutional amendment I can think of. It really has to do with law enforcement and interactions with the citizenry and the community. And so it says that it prohibits unlawful searches and seizures. So what's a seizure? What's a search? Well, a search is what it sounds like. The government examining you, examining your car, that sort of thing. And a seizure is where you are actually arrested, detained, that sort of thing. So the government is not allowed to stop you without legal justification, and they're certainly not allowed to search you without legal justification. So here, when we see excessive force, false arrest, unlawful stops, when, for example, when the government kills somebody, so a law enforcement officer is engaged in excessive force, they shoot and kill, or something like George Floyd, where they are slowly killed with under the knee of the oppressor, or in our cases, Omid and I were very fortunate. We represented those in Colorado, and I'm sure nationally know this, of the name Elijah McClain. Omid and I were very blessed to represent Elijah McClain's family, and Elijah McClain was our client. And so when you sue under these types, when the government takes your life, you actually sue under the Fourth Amendment. And death is considered a seizure by the government. It's an ultimate seizure. You're never going to move again. And so that's generally how you bring these types of claims. The First Amendment we discussed, and then the 14th Amendment also, it protects you from things like the government being able to come and take your house. Just come into your house and remove your property and that sort of thing. It permits, if you were ever charged with a crime, Well, you get substantial rights in the criminal justice process. You're supposed to. And all those are protected by the 14th Amendment. The right to be advised of your charges, the right to a jury trial of your peers, that sort of thing, the right to confront witnesses. Those are all derived from the 14th Amendment. And so, but I think the bulk of this presentation is going to be focused on employment claims. Christine will be speaking on immigration issues, of course. So, Romy, do you want to kind of go down some of these?
Sure. And I was just going to add, so because 1983 allows you to enforce your rights against the government, there are unique times when you are a government employee and your employer, being the government, be it some agency that you work for, when that agency commits some kind of employment law violation, you can actually sue under 1983 to basically say, look, government, not only have you violated my rights just as an employer, but because you are a government entity, I can actually sue you under 1983. But let's talk for a moment about what some of those underlying employment violations might be. And I've listed basically the big ones here, and I'll just go through a few of them in the following slides. But the biggest one that we see is Title VII, and we'll get into the details about that in a little bit. It basically relates to all the protected classes that we've seen developed here in the United States, be it gender, be it sex, be it race, religion, national origin. All of these are protected classes, and Title VII prohibits employers of all kinds, private companies to government entities to public corporations, all kinds are subject to Title VII. The ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Basically, you have certain rights as a disabled worker. The ADEA is the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. Obviously, employers are prohibited from discriminating against you on the basis of your age when you fall into certain categories. CADA, much like some of those state laws that we discussed earlier with the 1983, within each state, there are often their own sets of employment anti-discrimination acts and statutes. So this is Colorado's Anti-Discrimination Act, and it's a little bit more protective in some ways than Title VII. So sometimes it's useful for Colorado employees. And then 42 USC 1981, which is another federal statute. Cuser loves this statute, so I'll let him speak for a moment.
Sure, yes.
About 1981.
We're lawyers and we're kind of nerds, and I would say that this is my favorite statute, and I don't think many people probably have favorite statutes, but this one is it's tremendous. And I think that this one, if you're going to listen to one thing, this is probably it. So 42 USC 1981 came out of the civil rights era. I call it the Martin Luther King statute. And what it has so many applicabilities, but what it basically was created for was to allow African Americans to have the same rights as white people. And it actually, the statute, it's written very in an older language, probably not even PC at this time, but it basically says that. It was where African Americans were being denied access to private business. It's the lunch counter, it's the water fountains, it's the don't get at the front, sit at the back of the bus, get off of my bus, don't sit in my neighborhood, you cannot live in my neighborhood, you can't eat at my diner, those types of things where we see, no Irish allowed and things of that nature. So when if you remember, this is going back 3 years probably, there was that incident at Starbucks where it was pretty high profile, the video went viral, and there were these African American customers who were basically thrown out of Starbucks. That is what we call a public accommodation denial. Now, what was interesting about it was 1981 and what is considered the definition of race is a very interesting conversation. But there was a Supreme Court case, the name I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it analyzed whether being an Arab is a race. Because they were like, well, no, you're from the Middle East, or that's not a race, that's, it's something else. And the Supreme Court said no, that being from the Middle East, being an Arab, as you self-identify, is a race for purposes of this. So if you are, for example, gone to a store and they say, hey, you blah, 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 Arab, Iranian, that sort of thing, you need to get out of here. You're not welcome. You're not American. We're at war with you folks. That sort of nonsense that I'm sure many of you have experienced in varying degrees. This makes it illegal. And this is one of the most powerful, potent civil rights statutes on the books. So please be aware that businesses are not allowed to discriminate against you. Now we can finish, Omid, why don't we finish the FMLA
Sure.
and EPA, and we should probably pick up the pace here.
Yeah, and we can dive through some of the next slides quickly. The FMLA obviously is the Family Medical and Leave Act, and it deals with all sorts of medical leaves, paternity leave, maternity leave. And the EPA is the Equal Pay Act. Obviously, in the United States, for men and women, or all genders who are doing equal work, they deserve equal pay. And that statute is supremely important, very difficult to litigate because it's hard to say how much each employee makes without really taking a look at the books. But it exists, and we use it from time to time. So let's go to the next slide, and maybe we'll skip a few here so we can get going.
And there was a question, and I am going to address it. So one of the attendees asked, is taking a work laptop to Iran illegal? And the answer to that is nothing would strike me just sort of out of definition, taking laptops to another country, that action in and of itself. Now, whether your employer has prohibitions and policies against that, that would be a separate issue. But I imagine if you're a traveling employee, having this type of access is probably acceptable. So now, what if there's illegal content on a laptop? That's a separate issue, you know. But no, I have never heard of anyone sort of traveling internationally and the virtue of bringing in an American laptop to Iran. I would say that is not illegal.
And I'll run through these slides quickly. As we discussed, Title VII is about prohibiting discrimination. I'll say the key piece of this is, other than a hostile work environment, which is, it needs to be very hostile, even as sort of in the ordinary sense of the word, generally we need an adverse action, which means you need to be demoted, you need to be fired, you need to be some kind of actual action taken by the employer before that you have any sort of cognizable claim. So generally a few racist comments here and there, probably not going to cut it. For instance, a hostile work environment, there needs to be a little bit more. And you can't be retaliated against. If you go to your employer and explain, look, I think you all are being racist in this X, Y, and Z way, and they fire you for raising those concerns, that's also unlawful under
Right.
Title VII. So we can,
and this is a very important point Omid raises, which is retaliation. Now, if you're going to, hopefully you listen to the 1981 part, but if you're going to take one thing away from this presentation, another thing, it's the law requires employees to protest, complain about workplace discrimination. Everything in the law really emanates from that. And so if you are being discriminated against at work, whether it be for your religion, if any of you are Muslim or Zoroastrian or things like that, and there are you are facing discrimination for that, or just you are being discriminated against because they don't like Iranians, like we heard the story of the young woman who told us at the beginning. Those types of things in the workplace are very illegal, and I cannot stress this enough. That in my experience, having done employment law for 20 years now, that I have found that immigrants, particularly those who have not really found footing or understand the American legal system, they're very reluctant to complain or challenge workplace conditions. They will tolerate just obscene amounts of discrimination as compared to white people. And that really is just a creature of either ignorance or culture, of not keeping your head down. I'm happy to have a job and I'm not going to complain. Well, I would encourage all of you, and particularly in this type of economy where jobs are plentiful, that none of you should be tolerating harassment or discrimination in the workplace. That this country that we have, that we're very, very proud to live in, is the rights are equal to everyone. And these rights in particular that we're talking about are really, they're designed to protect minorities. And these rights are only as strong as those who choose to protect and enforce them. So I cannot stress this enough, that if you are experiencing any kind of workplace discrimination, workplace harassment, based on these types of characteristics, if you have a bad boss who is simply just a bad boss, he or she is a jerk, that is not illegal. Title VII is what we call not a civility code. But if you are facing discrimination because of your race, the color of your skin, religion, your gender, if any of you wear hijabs or you're being sexually harassed, that type of thing, well, it's smart of you to seek legal counsel and know your rights and learn the best way to enforce them. Okay.
Thanks, Kusair. You can go to the next slide. And I'll just brief through this one. As I said earlier, the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act is the state version of Title VII, and it provides, it's also a couple different statutes rolled into one, and it provides some greater protections in some areas, and sometimes it's advantageous to use, but basically it protects against all those same important rights that Kusair just ran through. So we could skip this slide. I may skip a few here.
Yeah, let's get to Christine's slides.
Yeah,
she's got some really important things. So could we skip ahead a few to the first immigration?
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's keep going. Let's get past this one too, please. Let's start with you. Yeah.
So good evening. It is an honor to be here presenting with Omid and Q and speaking with you all. I spend my days in immigration court preventing people from being deported. And so I love to share my experiences with you. I know a lot of you may be students, you might only have green cards. And I think it's important to understand that until you are a citizen, you are always at risk of being deported. Some of the common ways to violate a student visa, it's pretty obvious. If you don't pay your tuition, if you stop going to class, you change schools without permission, or you work without authorization. Those are reasons to not only be hauled into immigration court, but to have deportation looming. Criminal convictions, which my practice focuses on a lot, is another hot area, especially for college students. Find ourselves getting into trouble when we don't mean to. Some simple kind of bureaucratic violations are not updating your address with immigration service, claiming to be a US citizen to work, voting. This happened a lot here in Colorado a few years ago, that you would get a driver's license and they would automatically register you to vote and you didn't realize you weren't supposed to vote. These are all deportable offenses. So with a particular focus on criminal consequences, these are some of the common, they don't look to be so crazy. Shoplifting is a minor municipal offense, DUI, DWAI. Here in Colorado, marijuana is legal. So some of these things we just don't think about if we're a citizen, but have very devastating effects for a non-citizen. So again, somebody who's here on a visitor visa, a student visa, you just have a green card, domestic violence, prostitution. I see this all the time. Unfortunately, these might only be fine-only offenses, but they put you in front of an immigration judge. You will lose your student visa. You will lose your visitor visa. I consulted with an individual who was here from Mexico, a special treaty nation TN visa, got a an arrest for DUI, and his embassy called him and said, I understand you've been arrested. So yes, immigration is talking to different agencies, law enforcement, and if you are arrested, if you have your fingerprints taken, there's a sharing of information. So you can't really hide if you've gotten yourself in trouble. So let's skip to the next slide. And, you know, a lot of my clients tell me, but I wasn't arrested. Again, if you're showing up in court, this is going to have consequences on your immigration status. Other clients will tell me, oh, but I paid the ticket. I did all my classes, everything's fine. It's still a conviction. Immigration still wants to know what happened. Something to know. And I was just hearing about a bill today that they're looking to pass, a clean slate bill here in Colorado. You know, this idea of sealing your record for immigration purposes is a terrible idea. If you ever want to apply for any immigration benefit and you've had an incident with the law, you have to show how you resolve that matter. So until you're a citizen, absolutely do not seal your criminal records, because that might prevent you from becoming a citizen, getting your green card, or whatever visa you're applying for.
Christine, there's a really good question from Mariam in the chat. It says, she asked, does an arrest but no conviction of DV qualify as a reason for someone to be denied citizenship? It's a big question.
Yes. So immigration is very tricky and confusing. So when you're applying for citizenship, they look at either 3 to 5 years back at good moral character. So you may have been arrested, but ultimately did not have a conviction. They will ask you about it. They will look and see if you have similar contact with the police, similar problems. I can tell you, usually it's the best idea to give yourself a window. Let's let 5 years or 3 years pass from that arrest so that you have a clean, good moral character period on your record. But yes, they can look at non-convictions because it goes to good moral character. It's not an eligibility statutory bar, but if they think that you might have domestic violence, anger issues, they could, as a matter of discretion, deny your citizenship. Yes. Let's see, some other common issues that I see. And, you know, at the end of the day, what I'm advising is that if you have a question, you should definitely just consult with an immigration attorney. Prosecutors will tell you, no big deal, it's just a fine, it's just probation. You know, like I said, after you plead guilty, we'll dismiss this and it'll come off your record. That's not true unless you're a citizen. Everything matters unless you're a citizen. So until you're a US citizen, fine only offenses, you still need to see an immigration attorney.
Christine,
Probation.
how many of your clients would you say have been deported from the United States because of something that was a minor criminal offense that could have been entirely avoided had they just addressed it a little differently at the moment, but because they did it themselves or they hired an attorney that wasn't versed in immigration law, that they messed up?
Yeah, a lot of our practice involves trying to reopen old criminal convictions, called post-conviction relief, to undo the damage done by, oh, I'll just pay the fine and get away, get this over with, because it is embarrassing. You know, some of these types of crimes are embarrassing. You don't want your family to know. But yes, you should not just pay it and run.
So do you think it's as equally important to have, if you have a student visa, an F visa, or a green card, and you do find yourself being charged with crimes, do you think it's as equally important to contact an immigration attorney as a criminal attorney?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot, in my experience here at our office, we practice criminal defense and immigration. So, you get good advice. You're covered both ways, but a lot of criminal defense attorneys don't know immigration law, and they will just say, oh, I don't know. This is the best I can do. This is the best offer. And they don't really look out for your immigration consequences, though they're supposed to. So yes, there in one of the slides I have how to find an immigration attorney. A lot of us do free consultations, but absolutely, before you agree to anything, plead guilty to anything, you should see both a criminal defense attorney and immigration attorney, always. If you want to go to the next slide, yep. For those of us that are not citizens, again, just because you have a green card doesn't mean that traveling is always safe. They do look at criminal convictions within 5 years of your last entry. So you know, 5 years ago, you got convicted of something, shoplifting, something silly, and you go visit family, and on your way back, they say, oh no, you have a problem. You have this criminal matter, and they're going to put you in front of an immigration judge. So if you do have criminal history, you should probably talk to an immigration attorney before you leave the country. You should also be prepared that you will be pulled to secondary inspection on your return to the United States. You should have paperwork on hand showing that you took care of your criminal matter. Some other things to think about is if you're a student and there might be a question about tuition or something goofy about your schedule, you need to have that taken care of before you leave the country. The problem at airports is that attorneys don't have access to you. You cannot make a phone call and say, hey, Christine, I'm here at CBP at DIA and they won't let me through. You're never going to get to me. What is going to happen is they're going to interrogate you. They're going to put you in a room. I've seen them. It's like a jail cell. It's not pleasant, and you've been on the airplane for many, many hours, and you just agree to whatever they tell you, and you're returned home on the next flight. And then you're calling me going, Christine, this is what just happened to me. And it's too late at that point. There's not much that I can do once you're back in your home country. So if there's any question that you are worried you're going to have problems coming back, you need to talk to an immigration attorney before you leave. And the last thing that I want to hit on is your social media. I have talked to too many students who at the airport, CBP said, let me see your phone. If you don't hand over your phone, they might not let you in. You hand in over your phone, you better be sure there's nothing on your social media related to drugs. I don't want to see pot plants. I don't want to see anything related to terrorism, cartels, nothing. It's not a joke to CBP officers. And I've seen too many students be returned home and lose their student visas over social media. This is a big deal under Trump, and it's still going on. So if you want to go to the next slide, again, hitting the highlights, when to see an immigration attorney, before you enter any criminal plea, before you leave the country, and before you graduate, if you're here on a student visa. A month before graduation is not the time to talk to an immigration attorney. You need a plan if you want to stay here. What are next steps? And there's the link. If you're looking for an immigration attorney, you pop in there and they'll ask what type of information, what part of the country you're in, and they'll direct you to ALA's, the Immigration Lawyers Association, very reputable. So you will get a good attorney through there. And that's all I had.
Thank you, Christine. We have a few more slides on the banking issues, if you can skip to the next one. And I'll just tell you at the start, none of us are banking attorneys. This is not our expertise, but when I was alerted to the issue, I was interested in it, and I did some preliminary research just to get my head around it. And obviously there's some background with the United States and Iran with respect to sanctions. The United States has imposed sanctions on Iran since 1979 after the revolution, just to basically shape behavior. In 2015, as most of you probably know better than me, the Obama administration was able to negotiate the JCPOA, which is just commonly known as the nuclear deal, and we lifted several of those sanctions. Well, the Trump administration in 2018 pulled out of the JCPOA and reinstated several of those sanctions that were previously in place. It was under the maximum pressure policy. And so that's sort of the era that we sit in now, which is the maximum pressure economic and otherwise sanctions policy. And what we know is obviously that the Biden administration is attempting to renegotiate the JCPOA with who knows what degree of success. And as a move, just in the last couple of days, actually has lifted some pieces of the sanctions to hopefully make the conversations more fruitful, because Iran has said that a lifting of basically all the sanctions is the red line before they even consider renegotiating the JCPOA. So what are made up of what goes into these sanctions? Obviously, the important one that we want to talk about today is the banking issues. So if you could skip to the next slide. The banking sanctions flow primarily from executive orders. And I know there's a lot of text on here, but I wanted you all to have it just so you can click on a few of these links and get familiar with what's going on. They flow from two sets of regulations. When a president issues an executive order, it has the effect of law, and it allows agencies to then issue regulations, which also have the effect of law. And so what we're talking about, which agency we're talking about here, is the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And they've issued so many regulations that are ever changing and extremely complex. And I've listed the site there if you want to Google it. All these regulations are available to you on the internet. If you're really interested in these issues, you can go look. I will say at the very least, what I know to be true and what's true on the Department of Treasury's website is if you are a person ordinarily living in the United States, you can open bank accounts with US financial institutions. As long as you're not operating that bank account for or on behalf of any person or individual in Iran, you should have the same rights as anyone else to walk into the Bank of America and open a bank. And if you're denied those rights, there's actually potentially civil rights claims there under, to the tone of 1981 that Q was talking about earlier. Otherwise, almost every transaction between the United States and Iranian financial institutions, trying to purchase goods from Iran, for instance, every transaction will be frozen. As we heard earlier from the young woman who presented her story, it's going to be frozen. And that's going to be their knee-jerk reaction to almost every transaction in between the United States and Iranian financial institutions, because account holders and banks, United States financial institutions, can suffer severe penalties. So there's this sort of protective nature that banks are going through right now, which is, well, look, I'd love to be as non-discriminatory as possible. However, if I mess this up and I don't, and I allow transactions to go through that I shouldn't have allowed to go through, well, my bank's going to be on the hook. And so the knee-jerk reaction for many of them, as we've already heard, is going to be to freeze those transactions. And unfortunately, that may sound discriminatory in nature, but given the complex regulatory scheme that controls these financial institutions right now, that's just going to be their reaction. I will say that in reading through the regulations, I've found certain exceptions for persons in Iran paying student loans directly to the lending agency. So if you're a student here and your parents are paying loans into the lending the agency, then presumably that's okay. And as well, I found an exception for non-commercial personal payments to and from persons in Iran. All that said, my general disclaimer is this: if you are thinking about making a transaction between your bank here or even sending money to your family from here to Iran, you need to consult an attorney, and there's no simple way around it, because these regulations are constantly changing. The regulation system in the United States is one of the most complex law systems that we have, and the speed at which they can issue new regulations makes it almost impossible to understand unless you're a person who is constantly staying up to date with it. So this is not an area that you want to try to take on by yourself, because I've listed in here, there's a gentleman in the United States who had that same idea. He was accepting some payments for a company that he operated in Iran, or that his family operated in Iran, and he believed that what he was doing was lawful. And then they OFAC stuck him with a $130,000 fine. So despite your best efforts, you're very likely to mess this up, and you're very likely to get stuck with not a very nice outcome. I've listed two attorneys down here who both advertise themselves as OFAC sanctions attorneys, and that just highlights how specific this area is. So if you have transactions that you're worried about, my advice would be to consult them before you do anything. I'm sure that they offer free consultations, and that is just really the wisest approach that you can take before you do anything that nears on these sanctions. We'll see if these negotiations that are ongoing between the two countries result in any changes. But for now, I would assume that the transactions between these two countries are very, very closely looked at and almost very likely to get frozen, blocked, or result in fines for you or the bank itself. There's a question in here that does the monetary restriction against Iran include digital currency like Bitcoins? I haven't looked into that question specifically. I would assume that the regulations are written broadly enough to talk about any goods or services. It's not a safe assumption to assume that the law is not smart enough to take account of digital currency. That seems to me like a prime example of trying to sort of outsmart the regulations. And unfortunately, that's never a good approach, particularly when they're this keen on it and this interested in making sure that nothing is going on between these two countries. I think that's all we have in terms of the slides. And so I think we're going to turn it over to more questions. I know we were sort of answering them as we were going through, and we appreciate all of them. They were wonderful questions. But Shadi will let you take over.
Thank you for that very detailed presentation. I know many of our friends were commenting how thankful they were for the answers that they got to their questions. We do have a few other questions that remain, and thank you in advance for going through these with us. One of them from Shahla, she said, can I access my Bank of America account during my stay in Iran without fear? And we had a member turn in a question with their RSVP. Why do I keep getting dual citizenship pop up every time I log into Bank of America online banking?
The former question, can you access your bank from Iran? I think that's a perfect question that you'd be able to call one of these OFAC attorneys and very quickly get a short answer that shouldn't cost you any cash. So I would advise you to do that. The second one sounds to me more like a tech question for Bank of America. I'm not sure that there's any legal answer we can give you there, but maybe in the process of asking the attorney the first question, you can also ask that one. But I'm sorry to defer there, but I'll remind you that none of us are OFAC sanctions banking attorneys. It's very particular.
Here's another one. Is bringing money from Iran illegal due to sanctions against Iran?
This is not legal advice. My general reading would be that statute that says personal remittances are allowed. If this money did not come from, was not made on behalf of an Iranian business, it's just your money and you're carrying it from one country to another, that doesn't seem to me like it would violate those regulations. But again, I would advise you, that's another very discreet and short question that you'd be able to ask one of these OFAC sanctions attorneys and hopefully get a free and quick answer.
Do you think money transfer issues will dissipate if the U.S. re-enters a nuclear deal with Iran, as some speculate they are close to doing?
I don't think, as lawyers, we're not necessarily politicians, but in reading the news articles, which are just as available to you all, I think that Iran has at least made it clear that that's a red line for negotiating the nuclear deal. So it seems to me like if a nuclear deal is reached, unless Iran has a drastic change in their position, yes, we would expect the sanctions to be lifted.
Moving on to discrimination at the workplace. It says a couple of our NIAC Colorado members who used to be on work visas have been offered a job by a federal agency only for HR to rescind the offer. So they've just been offered. Does this violate federal equal employment opportunities, or more broadly, what should be done if this happens to you?
Well, it depends on why it was rescinded, right? If it was based on, I don't know, your immigration status makes you ineligible to work for the federal government, that would be an easy reason to rescind, which would not be discriminatory. However, if the answer is, once they saw me, or once they learned a little bit more about me, or they did some background checks and learned I was Iranian, something like that, then potentially, yes, if the rescinding is based upon some of those characteristics we discussed, religion, race, national origin, if those were part of the motivation, then yes, that could potentially be unlawful. Now, I can tell you that discrimination in hiring and the failure to hire folks because of discrimination, it's one of the hardest things to figure out and prove. And the reason for that is because you rarely learn why somebody a job offer was rescinded. You can kind of guess and you can speculate, but I can tell you in my entire career, I think I've only had one case where I did a hiring discrimination. And that's because the person, when they phoned the person back, they basically said, well, we're really uncomfortable with blah, blah, blah. And it was an unlawful reason.
Thank you for sharing that. We have, what if you're a college student who has been discriminated against by classmates, professors, or administration officials?
Yeah, all right. Well, so one subject area that we do practice quite a bit, which was not in any of these slides, is education law. Omid and I have done quite a bit of that. And the answer is there are substantial protections in the law, in local and federal laws about discrimination in the education context. And the general answer is this, that if you are being disadvantaged in your educational pursuits because of something like your race, your religion, whatnot, and very specifically with race and gender, education law is the strongest. So if your fellow students are harassing you, racially harassing you and things like that, or professors are turning a blind eye to that and you have complained about it, then yes, you do have some rights that you can file complaints with the federal government. Particularly, it's called OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, with the Department of Education. Those types of complaints are investigated. And so it's unfortunately quite common. We've seen it a lot over the years, where discrimination will get really ugly. You know, at CU, sometimes we've seen it. And so, yes, you definitely should explore your rights as students.
Sarah, and maybe a few laws that they can just Google and read easy articles on that come to mind are Title IX, Title VI, any others that are really important for students that are presumably out there that, you know, in easy articles to read?
No, I think that starting with actually just going to the website of Office of Civil Rights,
yeah,
the Department of Education has got a wealth of information. So, but definitely Title VI and Title IX. And also I have found that I've read student handbooks over the years. And oddly enough, while student handbooks are certainly, they don't really get into the legal basis, the rights that they generally state that students have are accurate. They're based in the law. And so it's something that probably none of you ever received or even know, but there are student handbooks at every university that outline various student rights.
Is there a statute of limitations for discrimination racial discrimination in the workplace?
Yeah, so statute of limitations is one of these, it's almost an impossible question to answer in this type of form. So the answer is that's really where I would say lawyers earn their keep. It's where people come and they present what happens to them, and then lawyers sort of go through the entire database in their minds of various laws and discuss statutes of limitations. But statutes of limitations in Colorado can be as short as 180 days in order to file and with administrative agencies to preserve your rights. they can be as long as what we've seen as 4 years under 1981. And so I know this is not a satisfying answer, but generally I would say 99% of statutes of limitations that involve discrimination in the workplace will be somewhere between 180 days and 4 years. Again, I know that's not anything to go off of, but I think the take home is that 180 days is a very fast running statute of limitations, and that you should never ever sit on your rights. If you are experiencing discrimination, you should be going immediately to seek help. Don't do it after the fact.
Thank you for stressing that urgency, and to have that voice and to speak up and say something, you know. Okay, it says, in the last 1 to 2 years, there have been numerous Iranian students with valid student visas who have arrived at U.S. airports only to be deported. And I know we talked about, if you know you're leaving, to consult your attorney to clear your social media. But if you're arriving at the airport and being deported, what's the reason for this, and what can be done if you have a family member or friend in this situation?
Do you think they're referencing like Muslim ban 1.0, 2.0, that sort of stuff under Trump?
I think so. And a follow-up question is, if federal agents or police question me, what should I share and not share?
Okay, I can take the second one, Chris. Well, actually, you should just do both, Christine.
No, go for it.
Well, I think you should answer the immigration question. Let's assume it's like the Muslim ban. Somebody showed up, like what happened here at DIA, right? When all those, I think it was a Syrian, there were 2 Syrian airplanes. They were in the air when the Trump ban came out,
Yeah.
and they were actually turned away at DIA. So
sometimes, you know, it's hard to answer those questions. I know that during the bans, there was groups of immigration attorneys like there demanding answers and causing a protesting and all that fun stuff. But it is really very difficult to get in. And it's one of those things that I would suggest, if you think you're going to have a problem, your immigration attorney needs to know when your flight's coming in, needs to know, you know, what family member can I contact? Because if you do have relationships with the CBP officer, an immigration attorney who's been around for a while, there are ways to get in, but you need to know all that information ahead of time. I need to know your flight, what time you're arriving, and what airlines. I need all that information to have the best chance of trying to stop something bad from happening, but it is extremely difficult.
Shadi, could you repeat that question related to law enforcement or communications?
Certainly. If federal agents or police question me, what should I share and not share? What are my rights?
Yeah, so this could be an entire presentation in and of itself, and it actually frequently is. Most of the know your rights trainings that you see oftentimes are exclusively focused on police interactions. This is a complicated question, of course, like all the other good questions we've received. But here's what I can do in 30 seconds. It depends on where you are being questioned and stopped, okay? So if you are being questioned in your home versus being questioned in your vehicle versus being approached in a public space, okay? So let's assume that the contact, I would say, that most occurs for people are in vehicles, right? During traffic stops. Now, your rights are, it is complicated. In a vehicle, a police officer has the right in Colorado to always ask for your identification. And if you are approached by any law enforcement officer in Colorado and said, hey, I want to know who you are, give me your ID. You must provide ID to law enforcement. Not providing identification to law enforcement is actually an independent crime in and of itself, all right? But the answer is this, is that you've all sort of seen the movies and the TV that says, hey, you have the right to remain silent. Everything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. This is called a Miranda warning. We've seen it on TV and it's used inappropriately, but generally that is the answer. You have the right to not answer any questions a law enforcement officer asks you. And as soon as you tell a law enforcement officer, I would like to speak to an attorney, under the law enforcement officers must stop questioning you in that moment and respect your right to counsel. Now, the right to remain silent is your right. You do not have to answer any single question. But the police officer can continue to ask you that. So you don't have to say, I'm going to invoke my right to remain silent. You just simply should not answer questions. Law enforcement officers are allowed to lie to you. And this is particularly problematic if you are a child, a minor. But just know that us in the law that represents people and have done a healthy share of criminal work, that it is usually, the golden rule is that it is usually never in your interest to speak with law enforcement, particularly if you are the subject of an investigation, and that you should immediately contact an attorney if you are being questioned by particularly the FBI. So it's not a very comprehensive answer. I would say the answers I've given you are so many exceptions to what I've said that, they bear discussion, but I did my best I could in a minute. So.
And I just want to add, for immigration, if they're knocking on your door, they usually don't have a warrant. You have no duty to actually open the door when they knock on the door. Just talk through the door, but don't open the door if there's a concern, because once you open the door, they just bust right in and it's kind of over at that point, but you don't have any duty to actually open the door. And you should know that ICE officers do not have warrants.
Yeah, we have a question in the chat. Can a cop detain you if a person requests a lawyer upon questioning?
They probably will, and it happens. And I'm telling all of you that it is better to say nothing, to ask for an attorney, and to keep quiet, and to simply go through the very unpleasant experience of being arrested and being booked in a facility and having to appear and bond out and all that stuff. That might be terrifying for you. And a police officer will, without a doubt, make you promises. Hey, I really don't want to arrest you. This is just not a big deal. I don't even want to do this paperwork. Man, I'm just here to ask some questions and I just want to go home. So, hey, whose weed was that? Come on, whose weed was it? That kind of stuff. The answer is never, ever, ever think that you are clever enough that you can talk your way out of these issues, that you can outsmart these folks. And I have found time and time again with youth, particularly, or those who understand their rights a little bit, which is the most dangerous thing, that they'll come from this presentation and say, man, I listened to that Omid and Christine, they're smart, I know everything. The answer is you don't. And so do not try to outsmart an officer, do not try to talk your way out of things, and never, ever, ever lie to a police officer. So, yeah.
I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of questions in the chat about bringing money over, inheritance money. Also, please note that in response to that, we have the information of 2 OFAC attorneys listed in the chat there. For the sake of time, I'm going to ask a final question to all our panelists, because we'd like to end on a more positive, hopeful note. How often do you see cases of people experiencing several of the obstacles we've mentioned this evening, but overcoming them, either through winning their cases or other means? If you would each like to share, or if you'd like to add your contact information for any of our friends to be able to reach out to you if they're looking for an attorney, or any final tips on contacting for free or low-cost legal assistance to discuss any more issues.
Christine, why don't you start with Shadi's good question?
Sure. Yeah. So yes, there's lots of happy endings. I think the key is to get an attorney as quickly as possible from the very beginning, so that I don't have to do a lot of cleanup or try to reopen things. It's just very important to get good information from the very beginning. A creative attorney will most times find a solution. So don't give up hope, and just attorneys are your friend.
Yeah, particularly, I think the statistics, Christine, I don't know them off the top of my head, but in immigration, isn't it just like those that are not represented, they have like a 10% success rate, and then if you are represented, it's like 80 or 90%. It's something drastic like that.
It is because there's no public defenders in immigration. So that's the rub. But yes.
Omid,
Sure.
your people would like a happy story.
I have many happy stories. One of my own, which is that I came from a big defense firm doing what we like to call complex civil litigation, which was between businesses, basically transferring money. When I realized that this is not what I want to spend the rest of my life doing, and I called Coursera and said, please come, allow me to come work for you and help people. And that has truly been the case. Each case that we take is an amazing experience, and it's a healing process for the people that have experienced just really awful things, from discrimination to sexual assault to excessive force, everything. The entire process of working with us, I can always tell, is a piece of their closure and a piece of them dealing with you know, this instance in their life that they wish they could just forget. But we allow them to work through it in a way that I think provides them with some closure, and that to me is satisfying enough. And I will say that you've heard it a lot tonight, which is go consult an attorney. The people that do this type of work, we don't do it because it makes the most money. That's just the bottom line. We do it because we care about you all, and we know that there are these rights in this country that are terribly important. And so if the knee-jerk reaction for you is, well, I have this big issue, but I can't afford it, I can't afford an attorney, make the call. You absolutely should make the call. You should explain your circumstances to these attorneys, because we always find a way to make it work. Many of these places offer free consults. I know we do, for almost all of our cases. So just make the call. Even if you think you can't afford it right now, we'll figure out a way to make it work, and we'll make sure that you get protected.
I don't have anything to add to Omid's answer. That was excellent.
Thanks, Coursera.
To all of our friends, our expert panels, each attorney's contact information is listed there in the chat. Their law office names, their phone numbers. I am wondering, will these slides that you shared with us be made available to share with all of our friends here this evening?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Sure. I think you all have a copy, so feel free to distribute it. There's nothing in there that we are too protective of, I don't think. None of it is legal advice. That's what we'll give.
Right, information they can look up. We'll make sure that we are able to find a way to get that information to everyone who attended here tonight. Well, we will give folks about 3 minutes maybe to stay on and ask any questions to be answered. But other than that, it's about 7:15 now, and we want to close out our evening. We want to thank our panel. Thank you to everyone who participated in this conversation. Katie and Caitlin for sharing their testimony. And I think one big takeaway this evening was to not sit on your rights. I know Iranians, we have what's called tarof, and we're very, I can speak for Iranian friends, just being very humble and grateful and being resilient through trials, but also being fully aware that you have rights, and to voice challenges and to seek out help. So that's a big takeaway, I'd say. Thank you again, everyone, so much, and hope you have a wonderful, restful rest of your evening.
Good night. Thank you all.
Good night.